Have you ever lived through a moment so devastating that it made you question everything you thought you knew about love, family, and the people you trusted most? I once believed that love, if protected with enough effort and enough hope, could survive any storm, but there was a night that shattered that belief forever. What broke me was not just discovering my wife had drifted into someone else's arms, but realizing my daughter, the little girl I fought so hard to protect, was quietly slipping away from me too. I did not understand how those two heartbreaks collided until much later, long after the damage had been done. I grew up in a home where loud voices meant danger and silence meant fear. Those early years shaped me in ways I could not see at the time. Hunger settled into my bones, shame followed me like a shadow, and I learned to brace myself before I learned how to read. According to what therapists today call adverse childhood experiences, early trauma leaves marks that last long after childhood ends. I carried those marks into adulthood, into fatherhood, doing my best to be different from the men who raised me. When my first wife left, my daughter was only 4 years old. She did not understand abandonment, she only felt it. I fought hard for full custody because I wanted her to grow up with stability and love and someone who chose her every single day. For 3 years it was just the two of us, trying to build a small life out of the pieces we had left behind. I thought I could protect her from every hurt. I thought love alone would be enough. When I remarried, I believed I was giving her the family she deserved. My second wife was confident, practical, and sharp, the kind of woman who looked unshakable from a distance. We built a home, welcomed a baby boy, and for a while it felt like we were finally stepping into a brighter chapter. But beneath the surface, small cracks began to form. My daughter, still carrying the wound of losing her birth mother, struggled with the tough love my new wife believed in. My wife did not understand how fragile a child becomes after early abandonment. Then, my aging father moved in, bringing his illness and his stubbornness into an already delicate home. And there I was, in the center of it all, a man with old scars and new responsibilities, raising my voice more than I ever meant to, watching my daughter flinch in ways that reminded me too much of my own childhood. I did not realize it then, but the storm had already begun, and every small moment was leading us toward a night that would change everything. Have you ever watched a family fall apart one small moment at a time without anyone realizing it until the damage is already too deep to repair? That was exactly what was happening in my home long before the night everything collapsed. On the outside, we looked like any other family trying to make life work, but inside the house the air was getting heavier day by day, and the ground beneath us was slowly shifting in ways I could not yet understand. The first cracks showed up quietly. My wife had a way of withdrawing without making a scene. At first it felt like fatigue, the tired kind of silence that appears when two adults are juggling work, children, and endless responsibilities. But her distance was different. It carried the stillness of emotional distancing, the kind therapists describe as shutting down to protect the self. She was present in the room but no longer there with me. We would sit at the same dinner table, but the words between us felt thin, almost fragile. She spoke less, smiled less, and began living behind a wall I could not climb. I did not understand it then, but she was already compartmentalizing her life into separate boxes, dividing what she shared with me and what she kept hidden somewhere else. My daughter sensed the change even earlier than I did. Children always feel tension before adults admit it. She watched as my wife's patience thinned and her tone sharpened. She watched me try to hold peace in the house while juggling work, bills, and my father's failing health. As my wife grew colder, my daughter tried to grow smaller, slipping into the role that psychologists call parentification, the silent instinct where a child tries to keep the household stable by not causing trouble. She tiptoed through her days, holding her breath around conflict, watching for signs that either of us might snap. And then there was my own part in the unraveling. Every layer of stress stacked itself on my shoulders. My father needed care, my son needed attention, my wife needed space, and my daughter needed gentleness. Instead, all I had left to give was whatever scraps of patience survived the day. My voice, louder and sharper than I intended, became something my daughter feared even when the anger was not directed at her. Fear conditioning is what experts call it. I had lived through it as a boy, and now, without meaning to, I was passing that same instinct on to her. Money was tight, schedules were tense, and mistakes felt heavier than they should have. Bills piled up, my father's health declined, and the house that was supposed to be our refuge slowly turned into a pressure cooker. Meanwhile, my wife's distance grew into something colder. She stayed on her phone longer. She smiled at messages she never explained. She slipped away emotionally, then physically, in ways that felt too intentional to ignore. What I once thought was stress or exhaustion began to feel like limerence, that intoxicating attraction that pulls someone out of their own life and into a fantasy that does not include the people waiting at home. I kept trying to bridge the gap, to have conversations, to understand her, but the harder I tried to reach her, the faster she drifted away, and I found myself wondering when exactly the woman I married had stopped walking toward our family and started walking out of it. That was the moment I realized the storm had not suddenly appeared. It had been building for months, hidden in small shifts, quiet sighs, and the growing silence between us, and I was only beginning to understand how deep the cracks truly went. Have you ever felt a moment when your heart sensed the truth long before your mind was willing to accept it? That was the feeling that crept into my chest the night my wife told me she was going out for dinner with a coworker. The words sounded ordinary, the kind of excuse every couple uses from time to time. Yet there was something in the way she smiled, something too soft and too practiced, that made my stomach tighten, as if a warning had been whispered inside me. For months, I had watched her slip into her phone like it was a second life, smiling at messages that no longer included me, coming home later than she left, moving through our house with a distance that felt like she was already living somewhere else. That night, when she kissed my cheek and said she loved me, the words felt borrowed, like they were coming from a version of her I no longer recognized. Hours passed, the house grew quiet, and with each minute the silence pressed heavier against my chest. By 10 o'clock, I could no longer ignore the feeling that something was wrong. I checked the location of her phone, not out of suspicion but out of fear, and what I saw made my throat close. She was not at the restaurant. She was 40 miles away at an address I had never seen. A man does not need proof to know when love is slipping through his fingers. He only needs a moment of truth. My daughter texted me around that time. Her voice, even through the screen, felt rehearsed, too calm, too steady. She told me everything was fine, that her mother was safe, that I was overreacting. But children struggle to hide worry, and I sensed something trembling behind her words. When I pushed harder, when I told her I was scared enough to call the police, something in her cracked open. She gave me the address, the same address I was already driving toward. It was then I realized she knew, not just suspected but knew, and had chosen silence over betraying my wife. Emotional alignment is what therapists call it, when a child sides with the adult who feels safer in the moment, even if that safety is fragile or false. My heart broke twice in that instant, once for my marriage and once for the daughter I loved more than life itself. When I reached the house, her car was parked outside, lights on in a place she had no reason to be. I waited, pacing behind her car with a mix of fear and heartbreak twisting through me. I knocked on the door and a young man answered, looking at me with the kind of annoyance people reserve for unwanted salesmen. Down the hallway, behind a closed door, I felt my entire world holding its breath. I forced myself to walk toward it, my hands trembling as I knocked. No answer. When I pushed harder and the lock snapped, the door flew open, and the truth lay there in a bed that was not mine. She looked at me with shock, not guilt, and the man beside her wore a smirk that I still remember in the quiet hours of the night. But the worst moment was still to come, not in that room, not in that house, but later when my daughter said she wanted to live with my wife instead of me. That was the kind of wound that does not bleed on the outside, the kind therapists call double betrayal, when the heart is broken in two places at once. And standing there in the dark parking lot, watching my wife choose another man and my daughter choose her over me, I realized that the storm had finally reached its center, and nothing about my life would ever be the same again. Have you ever wondered what happens to a person when every part of the life they built collapses in a single night? The hours after I discovered the truth felt like walking through a world where all the colors had drained away, leaving only the heavy weight of each breath. I drove home in silence, not angry, not shouting, just numb, the kind of numbness that frightens you because it feels too quiet inside your own mind. When I reached the house, my daughter would not even look at me. Her voice trembled as she told me she wanted to live with my wife, and those simple words felt sharper than anything I had seen behind that broken door. That night, I did not sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying everything like a film without sound, each memory pressing against me, until my thoughts felt tangled and too heavy to hold. Over the next few days, eating became a task I could not complete. My hands shook when I tried to drink water. I felt like my body was shutting down one small piece at a time. The doctors call it acute stress response, when the mind is overwhelmed and the body follows. For a man in his middle age who has already carried more than his share of old wounds, the collapse feels deeper, heavier, as if every unhealed part of the past rushes back at once. I reached out for help in the only ways I knew. I told the doctor I was sinking, though I softened the words, because admitting the full truth felt like admitting failure. She saw more than I said and urged me to seek support immediately. I tried calling my therapist, but he was away, and the silence on the phone made my chest tighten. When the receptionist hung up in panic the first time, the world felt even smaller. Then a young woman named Morgan called me back, and her voice had the steadiness of someone who understood how fragile a moment could be. She stayed on the line as I breathed through waves of fear I did not have words for. She sent officers to check on me, not out of suspicion but out of care. The officers spoke gently, the way people speak when they have seen too many men lose themselves in the dark. It was not judgment, it was humanity. But the moment they left, the quiet returned, heavier than before. I realized I could not stay in that house, surrounded by memories that felt like open wounds. I packed a bag and drove to my hometown, hoping that familiar streets and family voices might hold me together. The drive felt endless. I kept my hands on the wheel as if letting go would make me fall apart completely. Middle-aged loneliness is different from the loneliness of youth. It carries decades of memories, responsibilities, fears, and the quiet awareness that time does not wait for any of us. When I finally arrived, my family hugged me with the kind of warmth I had forgotten I needed. But trauma does not disappear just because you change your surroundings. At night, I lay awake, staring at the same kind of ceiling I had stared at as a boy, realizing how deeply the past and present had intertwined. It was only when I returned to therapy that the pieces slowly began to make sense. We talked about old wounds, about fear, about how trauma echoes through adulthood. Healing did not arrive quickly or cleanly, but little by little I felt myself stepping out of the storm. That was the beginning of what therapists call post-traumatic growth, the moment when pain stops crushing you and begins to reshape you. I was still broken, still hurting, but for the first time I sensed that the breaking might also be the first step toward becoming someone new. Have you ever reached a point in your life where the only way forward was to let go of everything you thought you could not live without? That is what the weeks after the collapse felt like. When the dust finally settled and the anger had quieted into something softer, my wife and I agreed to end the marriage. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no courtroom drama, only two tired people who loved their children more than they disliked each other. Looking back, it was the first decision in a long time that felt calm and genuinely adult. As we worked through the paperwork, I realized how much of our financial life I had never truly understood. For years, I believed we were drowning, always one bill away from catastrophe. But when the accounts separated and her debts went with her, the truth surprised me. I was not sinking at all. I had simply never been allowed to steer. Slowly, month by month, I learned how to manage money with intention. Financial independence became more than a budget. It became a quiet reminder that I was capable, that my life no longer needed to be a reaction to someone else's choices. In those early months of living alone, I spent most of my time in my bedroom, the only space that did not feel haunted by old memories. One day, I saw a video of someone building a cloud ceiling with soft lights and shadows that looked like drifting storms. Something about it spoke to me, maybe because it mirrored the storm I had survived. I built one for myself, piece by piece, burning my fingers on glue and wiring but determined to finish. When the lights finally flickered to life, the room glowed like a sky I could step into. At night, I would say, "Make it rain," and gentle flashes moved across the ceiling while cool mist drifted through the air. It was not just decoration. It was a sanctuary, a place where my mind could finally rest without being swallowed by the past. My relationship with my daughter slowly took shape again, not through grand moments but through small ones. I apologized more than once, Not for things I did not do, but for the hurt she carried. She talked, hesitated, then talked again, little by little. According to therapists, rebuilding attachment happens in tiny steps, and that was true for us. She began sitting beside me without fear, telling me about school, laughing at small things. It was fragile at first, but real. For a moment, I even opened my heart to someone new. She was kind, steady, full of light, and for a while I believed I might be ready to step into something hopeful. But life has its own timing, and when her father became sick, she pulled away. It hurt, not because she left, but because it reminded me that healing does not guarantee permanence. Healing is not replacing what was lost. Healing is learning to stand again even when the future is uncertain. And so I kept living. I rode my bike. I coached baseball. I kept building small pieces of joy, the kind you only learn to appreciate after everything else has burned down. When the divorce papers were finalized, I sat on my bed, the glow of my cloud ceiling above me, and felt something I had not felt in years. Not relief, not victory, but clarity. Pain reshapes you, but it does not own you. You get to decide who you become when the storm is over. And as I breathed in the quiet of that moment, I realized I was no longer the man who begged for love or the man who yelled out of fear. I had become someone steadier, someone softer, someone who finally understood that healing is not about going back. Healing is about moving forward and choosing, every day, to become a person you are proud of. Have you ever looked back on your life and realized that the moments that broke you also taught you the most about who you truly are? That is the way I speak about my story now. Not with the fiery hurt of a younger man, but with the steadier breath of someone who has lived long enough to understand that pain and wisdom often walk hand in hand. When I tell this story, my voice is not rushed or sharp. It carries the weight of experience, the kind that sits in a man's chest after years of trying, failing, healing, and trying again. I do not speak to shock anyone, nor to dramatize what happened, because the truth by itself is heavy enough. Instead, I speak the way many men my age do when we finally feel safe enough to share the things we once buried. I pause when the memories feel close. I let silence do its work. I let each part of the story breathe, so that listeners, especially those who have lived through their own storms, can walk alongside me without feeling overwhelmed. My tone changed somewhere along the journey. In the beginning, I carried anger in every word, frustration in every breath. But as therapy softened, those old wounds and time showed me that healing does not erase the past but transforms it. My voice found a different shape. It became gentler, slower, more honest. The truth is that I am not telling this story to relive the betrayal or to blame anyone. I am telling it because someone listening might need to know they are not alone in the quiet battles they fight behind closed doors. When I describe the night everything fell apart, the loneliness on those long drives, the moments when I felt like a shadow in my own home, I do it with the calm recognition of someone who survived it rather than a man still trapped inside it. Every transition in my voice comes from reflection rather than reaction. When I speak about my daughter, my words soften. When I speak about the collapse of my marriage, they steady. And when I describe the slow rebuilding of my life, they lift just slightly, not with excitement, but with the quiet confidence of a man beginning to recognize his own strength again. This tone, this slower and deeper rhythm, is not something I chose for effect. It is the natural voice of a man who learned the hardest way that healing is not loud. Healing is steady. Healing is patient. Healing is the voice you discover only after the storm has passed and you finally have the courage to listen to yourself again. Have you ever lived through something so painful that you later realized the pain was not only breaking you but teaching you, shaping you in ways you would not understand until much later? That is the truth behind my story. A truth I could not see while I was standing in the middle of the storm. When everything first collapsed, I reacted the way anyone would, with raw emotion and confusion. But over time, I learned that the deeper story was not just about betrayal or heartbreak. It was about the way we carry old wounds without realizing how much they influence the choices we make and the people we become. As I look back now, I see that every moment had two layers. The first was the surface, the events themselves, the arguments, the distance, the night that changed everything. But beneath that surface was the second layer, the psychological truth that many of us, especially those in middle age, only begin to understand when life finally forces us to. I see how my childhood shaped my reactions, how my fear of becoming my father made me overcorrect, how my attempts to hold the family together sometimes pushed people away instead of pulling them closer, and I see how my wife, trapped in her own needs and disappointments, drifted into a place where emotional escape seemed easier than honest conversation. None of this excuses the choices that hurt me, but understanding them helps me carry the pain without letting it become bitterness. What surprised me most was the lesson I learned from my daughter. At first, her distance felt like a second betrayal, but with time and therapy I realized it was something far more human. She was not choosing my wife over me. She was choosing emotional safety, even if that safety was temporary or misguided. Children, especially those who have felt abandonment before, cling to the person who makes the world feel predictable at that moment. That realization softened something in me. It made forgiveness possible not just for her, but for myself as well. And as I began the slow process of rebuilding, step by step, I discovered that healing is not the sudden closing of wounds, but the quiet understanding that pain can coexist with growth. When I speak to people my age, I often say this: life will break you more than once, but each break reveals a part of you that you did not know was strong. The real depth of this story is not the suffering but the transformation. It is the reminder that what feels like an ending is sometimes the beginning of a wiser, more compassionate version of yourself. And when you finally reach that point, you understand that storms do not just destroy. Sometimes, they clear a path you never would have walked otherwise.